Thank you very much, Mark. My actual specialty or subspecialty is participation in national scandals in the United States. In 1973, a young woman from Yale Law School named Hillary Rodham and I reported to the House Judiciary Committee to join we were the first two members of the staff considering the impeachment and removal of President Nixon from office, and he was removed. 13 years later, we had the Iran-Contra and related scandals in Washington, and I was the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department, so I was in charge of that. 13 years after that, I was minding my own business, and I got a call from John Podesta, who was President Clinton's chief of staff, who said, the president's being impeached by the Republicans in Congress. You and Hillary Rodham wrote the book on what's grounds for impeachment of a president, so there's only two experts in the country on this, and the other one is very much disqualified by interest. So we need you to come be an expert defense witness on the law, which I did. By my reckoning, 13 years after 1999 is 2012, so just stay tuned for 2 more years, and you'll see my name in Washington again. The idea that hard power and military strength are not going to be sufficient for the U.S. in a multipolar, interdependent world may seem like kind of a no-brainer in this audience, but I've lived long enough to see a lot of twists and turns in terms of the mix of hard and soft power in U.S. foreign policy, so bear with me as I give you an idea of how I came to this topic and perhaps more to the point, to my perspective on it. I was born between VE Day and VJ Day during World War II. That's Victory in Europe Day and Victory over Japan Day. My father had been in Italy and North Africa flying P-38s, and my earliest memory of a picture book was not Bambi or Dee Dee the Mouse. It was reading about the bombing run over Ploesti under the radar. So I was raised in quite a martial household. I can recall at grade school listening on the radio to the account of the French forces at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam being overrun. And I had the impression even then, based on my early training, that that was not a good thing for the United States as well as for France. In terms of U.S. foreign policy, in those days when I was young in the 50s, no question about engagement with the world. The Berlin airlift, which I think was in 48, had shown that we were committed after the war. The Marshall Plan, which was announced by Secretary of State George C. Marshall at the Harvard commencement, did the same thing. Radio Free Europe was very active, the Voice of America. And at the end of the decade of the 50s, Jack Kennedy was elected president and created the Peace Corps, which is by some measures the purest and finest expression of cultural diplomacy in American history. When President Kennedy stood in Berlin and said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I'm a Berliner, it was pretty clear he intended for the U.S. to remain engaged in the world in a constructive way. In the mid-1960s, I went to Arlsen in Germany to learn the language. And I was a boarder in the house of a woman whose husband had been killed by the American GIs not 20 years earlier. At the end of the summer, I went from the province of Hesse to Berlin to see the sights, and I was absolutely bowled over by the Kurfürstendamm, which is the main drag of then West Berlin, the luxury goods and the fabulous smells from the restaurants. In retrospect, I guess that was kind of the point. In Western eyes. Dollar diplomacy was king in those days, and trade and investment didn't just follow the flag, as they used to say in the British Empire. It seems that trade and investment were the flag, and pretty much on our terms in those days. In the latter 60s, I worked for Senator Jacob Javits of New York in the U.S. Senate. I was drafting foreign policy remarks. It was a wonderful time. There were lions still striding the earth in Congress. When somebody was going to give an important speech, the galleries overlooking the actual floor of the Senate would be completely full. Why? Because the senators were still listening to each other. There had been a remark, a dictum really, by Arthur Vandenberg from Michigan, who was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee a few years earlier, that politics stops at the water's edge. Largely true. It's a largely bipartisan foreign policy in those days. The words trilateral commission were not yet dirty words outside the Northeast United States. That was the U.S., Europe, and Japan. Became quite unfashionable. A few years after that, the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was in full swing when ping-pong diplomacy in 1972, the ultimate soft gambit, paved the way for President Nixon's opening to China. And that, of course, proved to be of enormous importance for the world, as Deng Xiaoping, Mao's successor, was able to set his country on the path of economic liberalization and modernization that has been the underpinning of their increasing prosperity and economic power to this day. A couple of years after that, the U.S. public was appalled by the Watergate case and the debacle, the denouement in Vietnam in 1975, and they turned to Jimmy Carter, who had made it plain that he was very much more inclined to accommodation and multilateral approaches than his predecessors. But it's worth bearing in mind that that did not last long. By 1979, just toward the end of his first term, Carter's first term, America did seem to be in retreat all over the world, and people were writing about that, and the public didn't like it, and they elected Ronald Reagan in 1980. The U.S. it's a big country. The Northeast is just a fraction of the country, and it's a right-of-center country at bottom, and there are limits to the appetite of the American public for accommodation abroad. That fact is relevant today. President Obama is going to need, I think, the eloquence of a Jack Kennedy going forward. And don't get me wrong, I do want him to do the things, the soft power, cultural, diplomatic things that we've been talking about. President Reagan, shortly after taking office, named the Soviet Union an evil empire, showing he was disinclined to position himself as an accommodationist. His Star Wars missile defense buildup, a classical example of hard military power, essentially bankrupted the Soviet Union by enlisting them in an arms race which they could not afford. And when President Reagan stood again in Berlin and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," he got what he wanted. In a bipolar world, hard power had won. It's now 20 years later. The Soviet Union is no more. There's only one military superpower, and yet it is obvious that reliance on hard power alone will not advance or even safeguard America's interests. Why is this? How can this be? The first reason is globalization. The ground has shifted beneath us. Beginning with the adoption of the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1993 and 1994, and continuing to and through the admission of China to the World Trade Organization, the economies of every single country in the world have become subject to irreversible forces of competition across multiple markets. It is true that in various countries a rear guard action is often fought, in this country notably by the labor unions, but the opponents of globalization are playing ultimately a losing hand. A free global economy is inevitable in the end because it's the only way to produce necessary goods and services for the peoples of the world at the lowest cost. And the result is a degree of interconnectedness. In fact, interdependence is not too strong a word. That would be unthinkable in the days of the Cold War. Literally trillions of dollars in goods and services cross national borders every day without a passport or a visa. Most mergers and acquisitions of any size these days are cross-border transactions or have a cross-border element. And countries now need each other to grow their economies. Access to markets is the name of the game. These are new facts on the world stage. If countries are going to be doing business with each other, lots of business, every day, it makes absolutely no sense for them to be ignorant of each other's history, culture, and forms of governmental and economic organization. There's seldom been a greater imperative for cultural diplomacy in every sense, for telling the American story in all its fullness, for listening to the stories of our trading partners, for people-to-people programs, for student and teacher exchanges, government delegations, and so on, than there is today. The effort that is needed is persuasion. The provision of information telling the American story is necessary as a first step, but it's really only the first step. An attitude of curiosity and a willingness to listen are required as well. Who among us was ever persuaded by somebody who said, "my way or the highway"? Nobody, that's who. Almost everybody has a story to tell. I was in Saudi Arabia shortly after 9/11. I was at an elegant luncheon where I met a highly intelligent and well-informed Saudi who had received a PhD from Harvard Law School. So we had an alma mater in common. I didn't catch his last name, but we found we had common friends, and he was a brilliant guy. We had quite a riveting conversation. All the Arabs at the table, in fact, were mystified by the 9/11 attacks, and they discoursed at great length as how and why they correctly viewed Islam as a premier religion of peace in the world. I left very impressed. The Harvard PhD was Abdullah bin Laden, Osama's first cousin. Enough said. I'm reminded in this connection also of the political aspect to this persuasion exercise. Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the U.S. House, famously said that all politics is local. And in this multipolar world, our major trading partners we can view as partners and rivals. And they can be in one coalition and not in another coalition. And the leaders of these potential rivals and trading potential partners in the multipolar world are driven by the same economic insecurities as all countries: food, energy, employment, health, natural resources. If we can offer these, or opportunities for these things, we can make headway in forming coalitions to address the intractable challenges that face all nations. But we need to offer something. If we want the full attention of a Brazil or Russia, India, China, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, or Turkey, we have to compromise in order to make headway. That again is something new for the United States. President Obama, I think, was wrongly criticized for compromising on Iran sanctions recently at the UN. He was criticized for doing it in order to please China and Russia. A better view, in my opinion, would be that he compromised in order to gain the support of China and Russia for the sanctions, thereby avoiding a veto in the Security Council. I've learned over many years in politics that half a loaf beats having nothing on the table. So globalization and the march to the multipolar world is the first phenomenon. The second reason the ground has shifted is that the nature of the security threats we face has changed. We no longer face a single identifiable state as our enemy. We don't even face an identifiable array of smaller actors. We face a world in which many citizens of many different countries could potentially be persuaded to engage in terrorist acts against the United States and its allies, from suicide bombings up to and including dirty bombs and the use of nuclear weapons. If we rely on carpet bombing the hills of Afghanistan to protect ourselves, what we're really going to be doing is increasing the number of willing students in madrasas, the schools, where young people are instructed expressly to embrace terrorism against the United States as a guiding principle, perhaps even the guiding principle of their lives. Not very productive. A different approach is perfectly open to us. We could do worse than to learn from Hamas, our sworn enemy. In Lebanon, they built schools and hospitals and immersed themselves in the local culture of communities. As a result, they then won the local elections, much to the horror of the United States. The threats we face today are not coincident with national boundaries or forms of governmental organization. A single terrorist with explosives can inflict harm anywhere in the world. Nuclear proliferation, weapons of chemical and biological warfare, infectious diseases, hunger, narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, financial instability, environmental degradation. These spill across any political border we may mark on a map. We cannot shoot a gun at these problems from Washington and make them go away. The necessary deployment of U.S. soft power is going to include economic aid, economic development aid, health initiatives, such as GHI and President Bush's very effective anti-AIDS and anti-malaria programs in Africa, food security programs, greater volunteer efforts abroad, multi-pronged initiatives such as those sponsored by former President Clinton, philanthropy, Bill Gates, U.S. speaker programs, visits by artists and performers, broadcasting abroad, sister state, sister city relationships, education and cultural exchanges, fellowships, libraries, book translations, English instruction, student and teacher exchanges, the whole range of cultural diplomacy. But it needs to be said that these initiatives will be more effective if we first engage in a bit of house cleaning at home in the United States. America has indulged itself in recent years in more than one demonstration of what I would call charm-free unilateralism, or even isolationism. We could stand to address the following issues. Number one, opening up our visa and immigration policies. Legal immigration to the U.S. has been dropping ever since 2000. This is quite frankly a tragedy for our country. Number two, combating ignorance, which is a national liability. 1/3 of Americans cannot locate the Pacific Ocean on a map. Americans do not know that most Muslims are Asians and Africans, not Arabs. They're unaware that the inhabitants of Iran and Turkey are not Arabs. This is the country where Wilbur Mills, who was at the time a serious candidate for President of the United States, boasted of never having had a passport. Number three, reducing our excessive level of national debt, which diminishes the appeal of capitalism in the market, the ultimate market of world opinion. Number four, avoiding the perception of gridlock and dysfunction in Washington, D.C. I must say I actually believe, based on recent events, there's some ground for optimism here. From what I've observed of the Obama-Clinton approach to foreign policy, in conclusion, they do seem to get all this. But they're not going to operate with a completely free hand. Not in this town, where the military point of view is well respected, and not in this country, where the general public subscribes to the idea of American exceptionalism. But if we get out there with a constructive attitude and an open mind and push a free trade agenda which plays to our strengths of openness and innovation, we will at least be leading with our best foot forward. Thank you.